Hi guys, welcome to another Flight Deck 2 Sim tutorial. In today's video we're going to take the excellent ZIBO mod and fly an RNAV approach in X-Plane 11 using real world operating procedures. Now I'm testing the latest version of the ZIBO mod version 3.25 Whiskey. For those of you who are familiar with the mod, you'll know that there's periodic updates done by ZIBO all the time, and it's really worthwhile keeping on top of it. Even in the past couple of weeks there's been some significant changes to the flight model, and it really handles and feels really good now. The FMS is pretty much all there, and now we're going to actually fly an RNAV approach as accurate as possible using the mod, obviously discussing any differerences with the real world aircraft, but it is pretty close to the real thing now. Now, currently holding at a waypoint called TIPOD. It's just to the south of Blackpool, which is where we're going to fly the RNAV approach today. Now, for those of you who are not from the United Kingdom, Blackpool is a coastal city in the west of the UK, and it's infamous for a copycat Eiffel Tower, and also there's a theme park called Pleasure Beach. But anyway, I digress. Today, after I've set up and briefed the approach, we're going to fly from TIPOD, self-position to a waypoint called Collid, and then we'll route to Roblu, which is the initial approach fix for the RNAV GNSS Approach runway 28 into Blackpool if you're approaching from the south or the east. Now I'm using live weather. Well, I say I'm using live weather. The only thing I've changed is the wind direction. I've switched it 180 degrees because at the moment in Blackpool there's an easterly wind, and I would like a westerly wind because we'd fly the runway 28 today. I don't want to have to land on runway 10 because there is no RNAV approach. So the weather in the sim, it's 270, it's 10 knots, the visibility is 10 kilometers, some light rain showers, scattered cloud at 1900 feet, temperature of 3, dew point is 2, and the GNH is 1001. And like with all my tutorials, just before we fly the approach, I'm of course going to show you how I set it up. I'm also going to brief you, and I'll brief exactly as I would do if I was flying this approach today. So just before we fly the approach, let's show you what I've done to set everything up. So we'll have a look at the FMS here. So on the descent page, 250 below 100, well, we're currently at flight level 80, so there's no speed restriction. We'll initially fly the approach at 240 knots, and then we'll reduce speed as we approach the airfield. The forecast page, I haven't put any forecast winds in because we're quite close to the ground. It won't really affect the VNAV profile from this height. And the forecast QNH of 1001. The fixed rings isn't still yet a feature in the ZIBO mod. We'd usually set that up for situation awareness on the approach, but we don't need to worry about that. Now let's step carefully through the routing. If I go to the plan page here, we'll set a sensible scale. That should do for now. And we'll go to the first part of the approach. We'll actually zoom in slightly. Oops. Here. There we go. So there's Roblu. Now, if I bring up the chart on the right-hand side, you can see where Roblu is here. It's the initial approach fix for the approach. Now from Roblu, we're going to descend to 3,500 feet initially, and then we could descend to 2,600 feet, routing to November Hotel 28 India, and then we'll make a left turn to intercept the final approach track, routing towards the final approach fix, which is November Hotel 28 Foxtrot, and we can then descend to 2,000 feet. After November Hotel 28 Foxtrot, we'll descend on the 3-degree virtual glide path to the minimums, which is 420 feet, which is an MDA. Now if you're flying an MDA, we actually make a slight correction to this height. We're going to add 40 feet, and that's because we mustn't descend below the MDA. So if we get down to the MDA of 460 and we push toga to go around if we're not visual, with the inertia of the aircraft, it'll lose a little bit more height, no more than 40 feet, and then it would climb into the missed approach. So by adding 40 feet, we ensure that we never get below the minimum descent altitude of 420 feet. So to set the minimums on the approach, I'm sure most of you know how to do it. You can set it using the Barrow minimum selector. So you can hold it down, which is a nice feature. It now increases quickly, and then we'll set 460 just here. And obviously the first officer would independently make that setting. So going back to the approach briefing, as I said, we'll descend from the FAF down to the minimums of 460. And then in the event of a missed approach, we'll push toga once and then fly the missed approach, which I'll brief in a second. Now lastly, you could just check here the landing distance available. Again, we'll do the performance shortly. There's some other warnings on the approach. It mentions here that there's an airfield called Wharton. If you're in low visibility, you might accidentally land at the wrong airport, so be very careful. Basically it says exercise caution when visually identifying Blackpool. And the maximum speed for the procedure is 210 knots. So you can see here at RW at the initial approach fix, I've already put the speed restriction of 210 knots there. So we're happy now that the routing is correctly loaded in the FMC, and just checking the chart again, there isn't any frequencies really to tune for the actual approach. The only one is the Blackpool ADF, which is 318. So you can see here on the ADF panel here, I've tuned 318 so we can track the NDB, and that's for the missed approach. Now, a little bit out of range here, but you'll notice the identifier will come in when we're a bit closer. Now, there's actually no NAVs to tune for the actual approach apart from the ADF. There's no VOR, there's no ILS, and it's all RNAV based, so it's all GPS and FMC based. The only thing that I've really set is the final approach track, which is 277, which you can see I've set here on the MCP. Now, it's really important when we fly a non-precision approach like the one we're doing today that we pilot flying briefs the pilot monitoring exactly how he's going to fly the approach, when he's going to configure flaps and gear, what modes he'd like to use. So we'll kind of step through how I'm going to fly this approach, just as I would do in real life. Now, the first thing we would want to do is to make sure that both pilots in the flight deck independently preset the minimums in QNH. Well, it's only me today, and I've already done that, so QNH of 1001 is already preset and the minimums of 460. There's something we need to also check called cold temperature correction requirements. Well, that's only applicable if the temperature on the ground is below 0 degrees. It's 3, so we don't need to make any corrections. I might do a later tutorial on that. Whether it's simulated or not in Explain 11, I'm not too sure. Other things we need to review is the configuration sequence. Well, I'll select flap 1 and flap 5 just after passing RW, and then I'll probably configure today gear down flap 15 just after the final approach fix at around 5 miles before the runway, and we're planning to use flap 40. The modes I'm going to use, well, I'm going to use LNAV for the lateral path and VNAV for the vertical path, and we'll use the automation until we're at the minimums, and then I'll disconnect. And then if we're not visual at the MDA, we'll fly the missed approach, which is climb straight ahead to an altitude of 2,000 feet, and then we'll make a left turn back to the Blackpool NDB, which obviously I've tuned as a raw data backup, and then we'll enter the hold, which is 095 inbound right hand turns. And if we are visual, we'll disconnect the automation, and we'll probably recycle the flight directors to get rid of the guidance unless it's providing decent guidance. Lastly, we'll then probably discuss the landing gates. Well, today the weather down in Blackpool, we're actually in VMC conditions. The cloud base is 1,900 feet, so we'll make a landing gate of 500 feet today. And this is the point at which we must be fully stabilised with the landing flap selected. And that's really the sort of briefing you would give to the pilot monitoring if you were flying a non-precision approach. How you're going to configure, what modes you're going to use, the actions if you're visual or not visual, and then lastly discussing the landing gate. Now lastly, let's just have a look at the landing performance. Well, we currently have 3.3 tonnes of fuel on board. We're estimating to burn approximately another 3 tonnes before we fly the approach. So we'll go to init ref. Our current gross weight is 61.4. If we're going to burn around 300 kilos, we'll call it 61.1. We'll select that there, and you can see here the performance I want to use, because Blackpool has a very short runway. We'll use flap 40, and then we'll actually select order break 3, which I've already pre-selected. And as I said, you can see here the landing distance available is just less than 1,900 metres, so it's kind of very short for a 737. But I checked the performance calculations. We can safely land with flap 40, order break 3. And after we've landed, we'll vacate at the end of the runway, make a right turn onto Alpha, and it's a very short taxi to the main apron. So that's the full setup and approach briefing complete for the RNAV approach into Blackpool runway 28. All we need to do now, I'll complete one more turn around the hold, and when we're at TIPOD, I'm just going to simply route direct to Collid, and then after Collid we'll take the initial approach fix to RW and descend according to the procedure. Okay, so we're still routing to Collid. The only thing I've changed is I've engaged VNAV, and we've accelerated from the holding speed to 240 knots, and we're approaching the top of descent. The FMS is asking me to reset the MCP altitude. So we'll imagine we've contacted Blackpool approach and we've requested descent. So they've cleared us descent, let's say to 3,500 feet, which is the height for the initial approach fix, which is set. 3,500 feet is checked. Push out into vent, and now the aircraft will descend on the vertical profile very carefully. Now, because we're descending to an altitude, we now need to select the local area QNH, which I've just set. So we're now passing 7,500 to 3,500 feet. We need to set it on the FO side as well. And we've got no warning flags, and the standby altimeter you can see is set here. We can't currently change it to QNH, it's on the American version of inches of mercury. So now in VNAV path, the aircraft is following the vertical profile. The aircraft's gone from FMC speed to reach the target speed, and now it's gone to ARM, and now I can manipulate the thrust lever to directly control our speed. Now, the next thing that's going to happen that VNAV will do, we see here on the ND as we approach the next waypoint at Collid, there's a decel point. The aircraft will then pitch from 240 knots to maintain the next speed of 210 knots, which you can see here is at RW, and VNAV will plan to do that with idle thrust. And remember, 210 knots was the speed restriction according to the approach chart, so that hopefully will coincide with the correct point at which it should slow down and decelerate. Now, because we're descending to an altitude with the QNH set, we now complete the approach checklist, so we just confirm what frequency we've got tuned. Well, the only one we're using is the NDB in Blackpool, which is the ADF of 318. We're not using the nav aids. The fixed rings, again, we're not using with the ZIBO mod. The standby instruments are set, and we have the final approach track set correctly of 277 both sides, and they would then complete the approach checklist, and we'll imagine that is now complete. So you can see here we're now passing the decel point. The aircraft is correctly now pitching for the target speed of 210 knots. Now it says here drag is required, so I'm going to just perhaps use a little bit of speed brake initially, just to ensure that we're not using or going faster than 210 knots of the initial approach fix. So we'll just use the speed brake up to flight detent, which is obviously the most we can use in flight. We'd never put it to up in flight because you get the ground spoilers that deploy there. So we'll match the runway, match the heading to our present heading as we turn around. Oops, just keep the bank angle at 25. And the speed's going back nicely now, so we can actually stow the speed brake again. And we're just carefully monitoring the vertical profile, monitoring the airspeed, and the whole idea again is to maintain a continuous descent. Now, after RW, our speed restrictions 210 knots maximum. I'll probably start configuring flap to slow down as we approach base leg and November Hotel 28 India. So now we're approaching RW, which is the initial approach fix, and you can see here on the chart we can descend to 3,500 feet. We can actually now descend to the next cleared altitude, which is 2,600 feet. Well, imagine Blackpool approach has cleared us to descend with the procedure, so that will allow us to now select the next cleared altitude. So we're now approaching RW. I actually want to start configuring flaps. So I'm going to initially just select flap 1 and open the speed window. Now, when you select flaps and you open the speed window, the aircraft stays in VNAV path. It would usually revert to VNAV speed, and that's because it's only following the vertical profile there. Now I can see already the aircraft is accelerating, so I'm going to go straight to flap 5, so long as I'm below 250 knots, just to ensure the aircraft doesn't continuously accelerate on the approach. Now you can see here the FMS is saying drag required because it wants to further slow down to make 210 knots. But I'm already thinking about the next planned speed of 156 once we're on final approach. So again, I don't want to be doing the next turn at any more than 210 knots. So again, I'll just use a little bit of speed brake there to help the aircraft slow down. And then the next thing that's going to happen as we approach November Hotel 28 India is the left turn towards the final approach fix. So here comes the left turn now. We can now select the next cleared altitude, which is the final approach fix, 2,000 feet. Carefully monitoring the airspeed. It's coming down nicely to 166 knots, which is the flap 5 speed. We've got the speed brake out still, but I'm actually now going to stow it and just carefully monitor to ensure that the aircraft still decelerates to the flap 5 speed as we turn final. So we can now match the runway heading as we're turning final to 277 degrees. So in the event of a missed approach, we can use heading select so the aircraft will maintain wings level. And we're now descending to the final approach fix quite nicely. The speed's looking good. What we'll do, imagine we've contacted Blackpool Tower and they've cleared us to land, so we'll just pop on all the lights here. And it's looking all good. So we're now descending nicely, flat flight, but you can see already the airspeed's slowly increasing again, so I'm just going to select flap 10, which is a nice kind of draggy flap setting, to ensure the aircraft continuously descends. Now the next thing that's going to happen, if you look here on the approach chart, is approaching the final approach fix, which is November Hotel 28 Foxtrot, where we need to then select the minimums. And you can see here on the left hand side there's Wharton. You can see why the warning's quite important. You don't want to actually accidentally land on that runway there if you come out of clouds. So there's 2 miles to the final approach fix. We can now select the minimums plus 100, round up to the nearest 100 feet, so that's 500 feet. Verify the pitch mode, which is VNAV path, and the speed window is open. So we're looking very good here. Next thing that's going to happen is just after the final approach fix, we'll start configuring gear down at flat 15. So you look straight ahead, just under the cloud there, there's runway 28 in Blackpool. We'll imagine the cabin crew have been seated for landing, and we're all fully stabilised. So what I'll do during the approach, pilot monitoring would usually be giving something called altitude distance cross checks. I'll try and throw a couple of in, but you can see the FAF, the final approach fix, we must be at 2,000 feet. We're just overflying it now. There we go, there's the FAF, we're at 2,000 feet, and the aircraft in VNAV is following it accurately. So now let's start configuring to land. So gear down, flat 15, and we'll do the landing checklist now all the way to flap. So start switches are continuous, recall is checked, speed brake is armed green lights. We'll continue getting the flaps down to flaps 25, match the speed, which I just forgot to do there. Keep slowing the aircraft down. Speed brake armed green light, as I said. Flaps we have 25. Now we can select flap 40. Pushing the flaps the wrong way there. There we go, there's flap 40. Landing gear, as I said, is down 3 green. Water brake is set to 3. Flaps we have 40 green light. The landing lights are on. We have been cleared to land. And you can see here, just passing 4 miles there, we're at the correct height of 1360, so everything's looking good. Now, top of the white bar there, this is the point at which we select the missed approach altitude, so we can now set that there, 2,000 feet. And the logic with VNAV on approach is that if you set an altitude above your present altitude, the aircraft won't go to altitude acquire and level off. So, now getting ready to land, checklist is complete, missed approach altitude is set. There you go, as the first officer's just now reminded me. And now let's have some fun. Let's try disconnecting everything. And cancel the order throttle and autopilot on. And we'll actually turn the flight director off now, and we'll fly completely manually. So a little bit off the centre line there. In reality it should pretty much put you on the extended centre line, but it's certainly good enough. And now I'm primarily looking outside, just keeping an eye on the speed there. But the attitude and thrust setting I have is very similar to what I'd use in real life in this current configuration. So speed's looking good. Coming back on the extended centre line, the package showed 2 reds and 2 whites, so we're on the vertical profile. Approaching the minimums here, so if we weren't visual at the green bar, which you can see just on the PFD, we'd have to fly missed approach. There's the minimums. We can call continue, back onto the pappies, just watching the rate of descent there, pitching up slightly. Speed's good, thrust is good. Continuously going a tad high with 3 whites there, so I'm just going to pitch down slightly. Back onto the pappies. Now I can keep the aiming point in the same point in the windscreen all the way to 50 feet. At 50 feet I'm going to look at the end of the runway and then use that infamous landing technique, check, close and hold. So centre line's good, tad low on the pappies. Check, close the thrust levers, just holding the attitude. Oh, a little bit firm and just before the touchdown zone. Anyway, not too bad. So speed brakes up, let's select reverse thrust. And I'm actually going to disengage the order brake now. It's still quite powerful on the ZIBO mod. There's 80 knots. And here's 60 knots. To idle reverse. And then we'll just roll to the end of the runway there. So now stopping speed assured, I can stow the reversers. And ground speed's around 34 knots. And we'll just, as I said in the briefing, vacate at the end of Alpha and then taxi onto stand. So, as with all my tutorials, there was a lot of talking there. It's because I was trying to complete all the tasks as realistically as possible by both pilot flying and pilot monitoring. So, I must apologise if it's a bit of information overload, but if you want to replay it, you can do as many times to get the information you need. So, approaching 30 knots, reverse is cancelled. We can now stow the speed brake. We'll select the flaps to up. And we'll start braking here. And then we can just just make a right turn there. And you'll also notice there, I mentioned on the rollout that the order brake was cancelled very early. I think at the moment, certainly with order brake 3, it's very powerful in the mod. I've already given some feedback. Hopefully that will be tweaked soon. But we were going to probably stop in about 900 and 1,000 metres had I not disconnected it. So we would have then had to have added for us to get to the end of the runway. So now we've vacated the runway. I've actually got some rudder pedals. We'd usually use the tiller, but I'm actually using the rudder to taxi. We'll try and clean up on the move here. So transponder can go to out of. Oops, just make sure I'm not off the end of the taxiway. That's good. Oh, it's very fiddly. There we go. Still on the taxiway line. That's good. Speed brake already put up. Flaps I've selected up. Order brake to off. Check the system page. It's all good. Flight directors off. Still 2,100. Put the speed to 100 knots here. This would usually be completed by the first officer as we taxi in. The captain would turn off the retracts and the fixed landing lights. Leave the turn off and taxi lights on for visibility. Ooh, not concentrating on where I'm going. There we go. Turn off the weather radar. And lastly, on the overhead panel, just the strobes go to steady. Start switches to off, and the probes go off as well. Cancel the master caution, and because it's a very short taxi now, we can actually start the APU straight away, which I will do now. There we go. And that's it. We'll just taxi on to stand here. We might have to wait a few seconds for the APU to start, so I'm kind of cutting the taxi line here a little bit. We would follow the yellow line in, and before entering the stand here, in reality you would need a marshaller or some sort of gate guidance, but there's nothing like that in the mod here. So we'll imagine he's there waving us in, probably telling us to slow down if I'm doing 9 knots still. So just tapping the brake occasionally. And oh look, we've even got the markings for the aircraft. Look, I'll try and guess where the 737 marking is, and we'll bring the aircraft to stop. There we go, that should do nicely. So now we've stopped, we can set the parking brake. Have a look at the overhead panel. APU still starting, but with the ZIBO mod you can actually connect the GPU straight away. We'll use the APU, and it's about timing it. We try and time it so the generator comes onto the bus just as we approach the stand there to save as much fuel as possible. There we go. APU's available on the bus now, so we can now shut the engines down. And I'll just do the transit shutdown flow. So fasten belts can go off. No smoking switch to off. Open the isolation valve. And we then turn the voice recorder on, which the switch for is usually here. We'll imagine that is done. We then select the engine page, and then we just wait for the N2 to fall below 20% to turn off the anti-collision lights. That allows the ground crew to approach our aircraft. And that's it. We'll then call for the transit shutdown checklist. Alright guys, that's the end of the RNAV Approach tutorial using the ZIBO mod in Explain 11. I hope you found that interesting and learned something new. I've provided the link in the description if you're new to Explain 11 where you can find the ZIBO mod, but it's certainly at a point now where you can accurately fly VNAV non-precision approaches based on real-world operating procedures. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Fly safe, and I'll see you in another tutorial in the very near future. Take care, and bye-bye.